Policy is a very important part of, sometimes say, the due diligence of carrying out the government's responsibilities for its people.
There's so many laws that we had to have done properly on effective date because of our area.
I've acted for quite some time now, I think almost 10 years, as an advisor to Tsawwassen First Nation and its treaty negotiations. And in the last year of the period before the treaty came into effect, I headed up a project on developing policy and laws as a framework for the First Nation self-government that was going to be undertaken and adopted by Tsawwassen First Nation.
When we reached the final agreement leading to ratification and then ultimately effective date, there were a number of milestones along the way we had to factor. And in fact, effective date itself is quite the negotiation process with BC and Canada.
Essentially, policy is a plan of action. It's the intention to take the community and the people and the lands and resources in a certain direction through actions of its government. If the First Nation is going to take on this kind of responsibility for its future, then it needs to be able to have in place these policies which say, here's what we want to do for this particular problem or this particular issue or this particular area of responsibility. Here's how we're going to do it, and here's what we have considered as the challenges, and here's how we plan to overcome those challenges, and here's who we're asking to do it and how we're going to carry forward. That's all what contained in the policy. And without that, it's very hard to have a sense of direction, and without a sense of direction, it's very hard to have both effective services and effective development. Because Tsawwassen was setting out on an ambitious project of self-government, it really needed to have a comprehensive basis in legislation based on policy through which it could operate its government when effective date came. And one of the concerns I know the Chief and Council and the members had was because the Indian Act would just essentially disappear on effective day. One of the concerns they had was that there not be a situation where certain things would happen in the community or on the lands that would not be governed by good policy and by good legislation and good laws, and that there wouldn't be kind of a situation where there'd be big gaps taking place with respect to orderly transition through to self-government and through the development of the First Nation and the development of its institutions and so on. So all of this meant that Tsawwassen needed to develop a future direction and plan for where it was going to go with respect to its government, with respect to its land, with respect to its resources, with respect to its services, local services, and social and economic development services, and all of these sorts of things.
The policy approach to lawmaking, actually, we had precedent with it in how we developed our Constitution. And we had hired a public policy grad student to help us lead a community Constitution building process. We had that precedent of looking at it from a public policy perspective through the development of our Constitution over several years. And it worked well, and it made the ability to draft so many laws possible for us because it was a far more affordable way to use legal experts more sparingly and to draw upon other expertise in making important community and political decisions.
You know, it's hard to be clear where you want to go if you're not clear what the problem is. And so getting this problem clear at the start of policy analysis, and then policy analysis after that says, okay, if we understand what the problem is, let's look at the things that are causing the problem, the kinds of things that give rise to the problem. Let's look at what our expectations of our people are. Let's look at other experiences with this kind of problem. Let's look at what people have written and said about this kind of problem. And let's bring all that together and see if we can now start to set out a bit more of a plan of where we want to go. Look at what our choices are. Now we've got this sort of figured out. What are our choices? There's always some different ways you can go about this. Involve more or less involvement of the government, different ways the government can do things, different amounts of attention it can be paid by staff and by regulations and by other kinds of measures. Figure that out and then make a choice, make a decision. And at the end of the analysis, you expect the council or the legislature if there's a separate legislature, as in the case of Tsawwassen, or perhaps officials who've been delegated the responsibility for that problem, to make a decision. And the decision then is the final endpoint of good analysis.
When we started developing a constitution, we hired a public policy student from Simon Fraser University. We found that was a very cost-effective way to get very, very bright people helping us with some major community building exercises. And she researched a couple dozen First Nation constitutions in Canada and the US, as well as other constitutions, sort of created a list of headings we could consider including or not including in our constitution, and then created discussion papers around each heading. So Tsawwassen membership would be an example of an exciting discussion. Are we inclusive or exclusive? Is blood quantum an issue? Those were some sensitive issues we had to work through. What are the limits on our government in our constitution? What are our principles around land, culture, and language? What should our structure of governance be? Did we like the chief and council system? In Tsawwassen's case, we decided to expand decision-making by having a legislature to pass laws in our budget and have an executive council, similar to the chief and council system, manage the day-to-day laws. But we've also provided for other governance structures like a judicial council to deal with adjudicatory issues, sort of arm's length for governance, to be able to challenge decisions our government makes.
Her direction was, we don't want to solve every problem we have, and we don't want to do everything across every area of responsibility, but we want to look broadly at across our jurisdiction and look across each of the areas of jurisdiction about where we want to go. And we want to, because we're assuming the responsibility of self-government, there's no more Indian Act, we want to know that our government has put its stamp on the direction we want to go with respect to all of the broad areas of responsibility, and provided the authority through our legislature to do that.
We get mired in the problems of the Indian Act, and sometimes it's hard to see beyond the Indian Act and the current council and whose brother got what job and these sort of things, and sort of step back and think, how can we fix this? What would be a better governance structure that suits the needs of our community over a long period of time? And how can we overcome some of these issues, right? And I think the Constitution is a really good starting point for that, and for having an expanded vision of your community and what it can be in relation to its governance powers. We were traditionally self-governing, so I think it's fundamental that we remember that our expression of self-governance now isn't entirely new. Although we've lost so much knowledge, especially in Tsawwassen, in relation to our language and our culture and traditions, we successfully thrived in this area for thousands of years based on being self-governing First Nation. So to sort of remember that as a foundation of our identity as we move forward, I think is extremely important. I think what came up with wouldn't have been my perfect view of a constitution or anybody's. It really was a collaborative process where everybody had to make compromises, and it was quite an experience, and it was really grounded in community participation. Initially, when we were drafting our laws, we had to ask ourselves a question about the sort of scope of authority we wanted to have. Did we want to do what was just basically required of us under the treaty? Did we want to do something a little bit further to a more fuller expression of self-governance? Or did we want to do something more ambitious? And we chose the ambitious route with that ended up being 21 plus laws, because there's so many laws that we had to have done properly on effective date because of our area primarily. We have lots of economic development interest, and for example, our land-related laws had to be done very, very thoroughly. So we took a close look at what we thought we could achieve, and I had a really good person, Doug, in place, who's had the experience of drafting law for other governments before. So without that expertise, I don't know that we could have done something so ambitious without that real lawmaking experience.
Your legislation sets out the broad responsibility and authority, the broad direction, and also gives the powers to enforce certain actions, to require members or owners of land or participants in your economy to do certain things. And all of that is the broad framing of the policy with respect to that particular area. Legislation is just one part of the policy enactments of the government, but they all are an expression of policy. Every time you pass a law, it's setting out a direction and certain kinds of means to get to that direction.
We've had a long sort of running experience with having community involvement in leading up to the finalization of the treaty and leading on to sort of legislation development. It was a lot to ask our community to be patient for, because the volume of information and the number of laws and the different drafts and the information management was extremely challenging in such a compressed time period. But I found that most of our community was willing to sort of give us a little bit of room and latitude to make some of these decisions, because we had so much to figure out in a short period of time, knowing that we can change things and improve upon them later. And I think that was the real key, is to remember that we won't get things perfect and that we have to provide for flexibility so that we can learn from our mistakes and improve upon what we've developed. We are still working on the next sort of phase of implementation and don't have to ask anybody if what we're doing is okay other than ourselves, right? So our new legislative structure under our Constitution has been up and running since February 1st. It's got to pass our first budget by April. Hopefully that goes okay, but this is all brand new to us, so we are still having to make all these new processes and figuring it out as we go along. It's still very challenging. Hopefully after this first year and we've got the first reporting cycle underway, it'll come a bit easier, but we will be undergoing our first audit under the treaty, and it should be much, much, much more simpler than it was under Indian Affairs. So already there's a greatly lessened sort of presence of Indian Affairs in our life.
For First Nations to really, now that more and more are taking on responsibilities for effective governance, which I think is really encouraging and really important to solving and addressing the kinds of issues and problems that First Nations want to address in their communities. The successes are going to come from, this kind of governing oneself, governing one's own First Nation. In order for that to really work well, now that they're more interested in taking it on, it's important to have these skills and processes to develop the ability to make informed and good decisions in the way I've talked about. And this means really the staff of the First Nation, the bureaucracy or the officials of the First Nation, learning how to be part of that review of problems and how to be part of that analysis of the problems and analysis of the solution, and supporting the chief and the council and others who are making these decisions through that kind of analysis, and being out there talking to and involving the members and the people themselves.
The snowball is kind of rolling down the hill, so to speak, and there's still a lot we need to sort out and keep on top of. And in the treaty process, this is stage 6. I don't think, especially in between ratification and implementation, there's no financial resources really for the work that needs to be done. Our treaty was somewhat cash shy and more land rich in our overall settlement, so we don't have a lot of extra resources for some of this developmental work that is just so critical for us right now. I talk about surveying the community and benchmarking where we're at. I want to know what they feel about their institution, and if that if we can measure their satisfaction with it over time, their governance, that sort of thing, that's something that is very much of interest to me. And so we're partnering with UBC Sociology Department with a fellow who's experienced in sort of benchmarking more intangible types of things, such as faith in institutions, not just, how much money are people making. So, and success is not just about that, is our culture thriving, again, and those sorts of things. We have lots of hopes and aspirations, and for any community, I don't think you ever get it right. You can always aspire to be better than what you are. Self-government in itself, while it is an important end product, it's the path to self-governance that you really are doing your community building. In my vision, self-governance is supposed to be about our community, taking care of our community.